Welcome back everyone for Module 3, and in this module we will talk more about human energy. So as you're probably pretty well aware, the human body is well equipped with a number of metabolic systems that we use and rely on to be able to both produce and regulate energy for all of our diverse needs, and this can include such things as synthesis of tissue or even movement of substances between tissues and even muscular contractions for doing muscular work. A discussion of the role of nutrition as a means to help provide and control human energy will now follow in this module. For the purpose of this course, when we say or refer to energy, it is to represent the ability or capability to do work. And work in and of itself is also another form of energy, and it's usually called or referred to as mechanical or kinetic energy. So in other words, if we throw a football down a football field, we have done work and we have also produced mechanical energy. But we need to understand more about energy, and we need to know that there are 6 basic types of energy, including the ones that occur in nature, such as the light energy from the sun, or nuclear energy from the earth in the form of uranium, or electrical energy in lightning storms, or heat energy coming from fires, and the chemical energy in oil. The 6 forms of energy, however, that you see before you, mechanical, chemical, heat, electrical, light, and nuclear, are interchangeable according to the various laws of thermodynamics. Now, in the human body, 4 of these types of energy are really important, and even more so for sport or exercise performance. Our bodies have stores of chemical energy that can be used to produce electrical energy for the creation of electrical nerve impulses to be able to do muscular work, and to produce heat energy to help keep our body temperature at a stable 98.6 degrees, even if it's cold outside. And lastly, to be able to produce mechanical energy through muscle shortening so that we can move about and move our limbs. In terms of sports or exercise, mechanical, chemical, and heat energy will be looked at as the most important. The sun is really the ultimate source of all energy, and solar energy is harnessed by plants through photosynthesis to then produce either plant carbohydrates, fats, or proteins, all forms of stored chemical energy. Now, when the humans then consume plant and animal foods, the carbohydrates, the fats, and the proteins all undergo a series of metabolic changes and are used to develop either body structure or to regulate body processes or to provide a storage form of chemical energy. In terms of the energy cost to humans, mechanical energy is expressed as the capacity to do metabolic work, whereas chemical energy is the stored form of energy, such as ATP in our cells. Lastly, heat energy, maybe as a product of metabolism or the thermal effect of food, is another form of human energy. We all know and mostly accept that nutrition requires that we use some math, but there are some other sciences that are required, some along the lines of the natural or more organic sciences. But a lot of times people don't realize that physics can also creep into the area of nutrition, mostly when we talk about work and power. Now, we've already described energy as being defined as the ability to do work. And according to a textbook definition, work is simply the product of force times distance. So if we wrote that out, it would look just like this. If we were to talk about how fast work is done, however, the term power would be used. So a way to express that is to say power is simply work divided by time, or power equals work divided by time. So again, not a huge thing to get hung up on here, but something to be aware of in terms of quantifying the science. In exercise labs or clinics, the clinician might rely on an ergometer to measure work or physical activity. Outside of lab settings, the general public has relied on pedometers, or with advancing technology, now we look at accelerometers, even paired with different GPS technologies to help track and monitor work and physical activity. But falling short of that, using just the regular old heart rate monitor is still a sufficient way to measure work and physical activity. there are a couple of different ways that we can describe or express energy. And the most common term that's used in the past and still most prevalent today and understood within the United States is the calorie. So a calorie is a measure of heat, and 1 gram calorie then represents the amount of heat that's needed to raise the temperature of just 1 gram of water to just 1 degree Celsius. On a smaller level, a kilocalorie is equal to 1,000 smaller calories, and it's the amount of heat that's needed to raise 1 kilogram of water to 1 degree Celsius. Now in human nutrition, because the gram calorie is so small, the kilocalorie is the main expression of energy. In human beings, ATP is the main and immediate source of energy for metabolic activity, including muscular contraction. Now, PCR, which is phosphocreatine, can regenerate ATP rapidly, and this is a cycle that is set up to allow our body to be able to recover and make more energy or ATP for muscular work under different conditions. Both ATP and PCR are in pretty short supply, however. Therefore, they are only useful for activities of a certain duration and intensity. Carbohydrate, fat, and protein can be used and metabolized to produce ATP and phosphocreatine. The oxygen energy system is a little bit different in that it involves some oxidation, and typically we refer to this as aerobic energy, and on a scientific level we call it aerobic glycolysis when we're referring to the oxidation of glycogen or glucose. If we are referring to the oxidation of fatty acids, then we're talking about aerobic lipolysis. Pyruvate is a byproduct of aerobic glycolysis and becomes available for a transition reaction and is first metabolized in a transition reaction with acetyl-CoA. So it's actually acetyl-CoA that can then enter into what we call the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And this is another way that we make aerobic energy. We need to have a way to quantify metabolism. And what is metabolism? In trying to describe or define it, we would use or rely on the following items. The first one being the basal metabolic rate, and this is a resting value. And this is a value that is meant to describe what is needed to maintain basal or baseline metabolism. And it's pretty low in that only sleeping metabolism would be lower. The next abbreviation would be the BEE, or basal energy expenditure. So we're starting to load up with a few abbreviations here, and it gets a little bit thicker. So bear with the process of learning these because they do build upon each other, as you'll see. The basal energy expenditure is the BMR, which was referenced previously, which is extrapolated over a 24-hour time period. The next value to understand is the resting metabolic rate, or RMR, and this would be the BMR plus any small amounts due to prior activity. In other words, it's not a baseline value such as just getting up in the morning. Next, we have the resting energy expenditure, or the REE, which builds on the last combination of numbers, which is the RMR, and that is data or a number or value that is extrapolated over 24 hours. The next contributor or action related to metabolism is the thermal effect of food, and this is that natural elevation in one's resting metabolic rate due to just digesting food and the process of chewing and motility. And this is sometimes known as dietary-induced thermogenesis, or DIT. The next contributor is the thermal effect of exercise, and this is that increase in one's metabolic rate associated with doing exercise, but we can also look at it as the after effects of exercise, or maybe for someone who's made exercise a lifelong habit or a long enough habit to affect metabolism. Let's continue to establish the link between nutrition and metabolism by asking this question: what effect does eating a meal have on one's metabolic rate or their metabolism? Now, hopefully you thought of the thermal effect of food, and we know that in general, one's metabolic rate is elevated after eating food or consuming a meal. But we have to be able to quantify that, and the TEF is actually expressed as a percent of the overall food or meal being consumed, and it's a range from 5 to 10%. So as an example, if a meal is 400 calories, the thermal effect of food and metabolism requiring calories could be up to 40 calories. And you can see with a subject eating multiple meals throughout the day, maybe 5, 6, or more times, that the TEF can become a considerable or significant consideration to look at and manage in some weight-controlled diets. Let's look at a couple of different examples to estimate resting metabolic rate. Now, the first subject, 20 years old, is 154 pounds, which when converted is 70 kilograms. So from the top part of the slide, under the males category, in the 18 to 29-year-olds, we would see the equation being 15.3 times their body weight, and then we would add 679. So on the very bottom of the slide, we see the math being done, 15.3 times the kilograms, then adding 679 to get at 1,750 calories for this subject in terms of their resting metabolic rate. The same steps are required for our next subject in that we know her age and we also convert her pounds to kilograms. So 20 years old and 55 kilograms. At that age group, we know that her multiplier is 14.7 and we're going to add 496 to that number for a result of 1,304 calories for this subject in terms of her resting metabolic rate. To account for the plasticity or differences among the population, it might be useful to know how to estimate a range of resting metabolic rate. So we would look at this range to be 10% higher or lower than the number that we get. For the first subject that we estimated, we had 1,750 calories. 10% would be 175, making the range for this person 1,575 calories on up through the upper end of the range at 1,925 calories. This was done by adding or subtracting that 10% to the original number that we got. The same math applies for the second subject. Her 10% value was 130 calories. When we add or subtract that to her base, we come up with a new range of 1,174 to 1,434 calories per day. Since we know that the REE, or resting energy expenditure, is an important process that contributes to the overall sum of metabolism, it might be helpful to know the genetic factors that influence REE, and the first one is age. Now, we know that the age-related decline in resting energy expenditure in humans is due mostly to the loss of fat-free mass and the changes in the metabolically active components that are involved in this change. But we also see the REE being 10 to 15% lower for females. In terms of practical application, let's look at one component of fitness and how it affects the REE, or resting energy expenditure. So we'll look at body composition to do this, and of course we know that that's the difference between fat-free mass and muscle versus fat. So consider this. Someone losing body weight is not really going to lose just fat. They're going to lose fat and muscle. And since the fat-free mass and muscle is involved, this could potentially lower REE. However, if we could have a subject that was able to maintain normal body weight while reducing their body fat by percent and still increasing their muscle mass, well, this would be a way to raise REE, or the resting energy expenditure, because there would be more fat-free mass. We've looked at a couple of different examples to establish an estimation of resting metabolic rate, and now we're going to look at how physical activity, or specifically muscular work or exercise, what this effect has on one's metabolic rate. So in general, we should know that all physical activity will increase one's metabolic rate and metabolism. We also know that activities of daily living will even increase metabolism. Just anything beyond a sleep or resting level of activity will contribute to increased caloric demand. So this then transitions into our discussion on the need to be able to quantify how muscular work or physical activity would affect the metabolic rate. The most accurate and precise way to measure and analyze or assess metabolic rate during exercise is to do what's known as a VO2 max test. Now, this is a measure of oxygen consumption, and it's pretty accurate when it's done properly under the supervision of a physician in a clinic or a lab setting. But this is just not as practical for most of us who will be working in the field with athletes or in clubs with clients. So instead, we turn to more practical technology and yet still keep an objective measure in using heart rate monitors or using testing protocols that rely on us to measure the respiratory rate of the test subject in order to assess metabolic activity during exercise. For the balance of this module, we'll be looking at the relationship between human energy systems, exercise, and fatigue. Both exercise intensity and duration are major factors that determine which energy system is going to dominate or be used during an exercise. So it's important to remember that most exercise will use a blend of all three major human energy systems, but only one will dominate for one particular activity depending on how intense the activity is or for how long in duration the activity goes for. Let's wrap up Module 3 with our discussion on chronic fatigue. Now, it's important to understand that fatigue can be either acute or chronic, and for the environments where we will be applying our knowledge, skills, and abilities as nutritionists, we're more likely to see fatigue that is related to overreaching, where maybe a workout or two for maybe a week or two have been too great in intensity or too long in duration, and the fatigue related to that might impair performance. Or we see fatigue as a required element or component of a planned phase of training planning or periodization. But when overreaching continues for a prolonged period of time, it transitions into overtraining. We also might see fatigue as related to chronic fatigue syndrome. Proper food intake and solid nutritional planning may help people with chronic fatigue syndrome to better or more easily control their fatigue levels. If our goal is to delay the onset of fatigue among athletes or those who are physically active, we need to look at the proper sport training as the most effective means to be able to delay the onset of this fatigue. So physiological training, psychological training, and biomechanical training will all help delay the onset of fatigue. The one where a nutritionist would make the most impact would be in the physiological training, whereby we would be looking at training specific energy systems, and as you recall, our energy systems are affected directly by our nutrient intake. Psychological training and biomechanical training are equally as important, but the role of nutrition in these particular aspects of delaying fatigue are not as strong as the nutrition that's required for physiological training. Module 3 gave us the opportunity to look at energy in terms of how humans tap into the energy cycle to use mechanical, chemical, and electrical energy for physiological function. Then we turned our discussion to metabolic systems and described different metabolic processes that are important for someone in nutrition to know of. And we zeroed in further for that same reason on resting metabolic rate, as this is a foundational number used for a lot of equations or to make recommendations to a subject based on nutrition using science and math. We therefore had to also look at other other factors that influence metabolism, such as body composition or exercise, and we even discussed age or genetic factors. We then turned our discussion to conclude with fatigue and the ways that nutrition is linked with helping fatigue or to prevent the onset of fatigue in those who exercise or those who are physically active. Now, that concludes Module 3, and for Module 4, we will dive into our first macronutrient, dedicating the entire module to carbohydrates. So we will see you back for that.